Uncle George, as everybody in the family knows him, still lives in the same farmhouse where he has lived since he was 1 month old in 1919, about 5 miles from where my ancestor, Daniel Sizemore, lived. Shortly after the dueling family reunions, I gave Uncle George a call and asked if I could pay him a visit. He readily agreed. At the time, this was about 10 years ago, he was a very vigorous 91-year-old, towering figure. He's 6'4", 240 pounds, immense hands, as you can see. When we shook hands, mine disappeared inside his. By the way, he is 101 now. He's still with us and still living alone in that same house. At that first meeting, I wasn't quite sure how to bring up the subject of slavery. But as it turned out, I needn't have worried. Uncle George was happy to talk about his family history. One of the first things he told me was this: my daddy was born a slave. I had to let that sink in for a moment. You know, how was it possible that in 2010 that someone could be only one generation removed from slavery? But once he explained it, the math worked out. Uncle George's father, Ben Sizemore, right here, was born in 1858. He fathered 6 children with his first wife and 5 with his second wife. Uncle George was the next to last of those. He was born when his father was 61. Uncle George told me that Ben and his brother Stephen were the sons of a slave named Daniel, the same name as my slave-owning ancestor. At that, I did another double take. As soon as I could after that first visit with Uncle George, I went scurrying back to the census records. And this time I looked in the 1870 census, the first one after emancipation, which of course was the first to identify African Americans by name. And there I found this: 1870 census, Clarksville Township. There's my ancestor, Daniel Sizemore. He's a farmer, 81 years old, white. He still had some adult children, unmarried adult children living with him. And right next door was Daniel Sizemore, 36-year-old black farm worker. That's Uncle George's father, with his 2 sons, Stephen and Ben. Very likely they were living in the same cabin where they had lived as slaves. Now, how did it happen that Uncle George's ancestor and mine had the same first name? We can only guess. One question that naturally arises is whether we are related by blood. Because, let's get real. One of the painful truths about slavery is that slave owners often took advantage of their position of power to have intimate relations with their female slaves. It was very common. In most cases, it would probably be fair to characterize those relationships as rape. So we decided, Uncle George and I, to find out. We took DNA tests. He and I both took a test that focuses on the Y chromosome, which occurs only in males, and it's passed down from father to son. And anybody want to guess how that came out? The result was negative. He and I, according to the test, have no shared male ancestor. Even so, some of us didn't quite trust that result, and so Uncle George's niece, Eugene, and I took a different kind of DNA test called an autosomal test, which reveals blood relationships stretching out to distant cousins. And the result was the same. No blood relationship was found there either. One other thing that autosomal test shows is ethnic makeup. Mine was found to be 100% European. Eugene's is 85% African, 12% European, and 3% Native American. Uh, Traces of European ancestry, or often more than traces, are common among African Americans. And Uncle George, by the way, is no exception. He once told me that when he was a boy, he was puzzled by a curious bond that seemed to exist between his mother and two white brothers who ran a funeral business. There were no black undertakers in Mecklenburg County in those days. And whenever there was a funeral in the neighborhood, the two white undertakers would always hug his mother. And when Uncle George asked why, she for a long time she evaded the question. But finally, when he was a teenager, she told him. She said, "We're cousins." Her mother, Uncle George's grandmother, born in 1857, had a white father. Anyway, over the next few years, I got to know many members of Uncle George's family, many of whom joined the Great Migration out of the South in the first half of the 20th century. They went in search of economic opportunity and to escape Jim Crow and the threat of racist violence. They're scattered throughout the Northeast now, from New Jersey to Boston. They come together every year for their reunion. I've been to several of them. They're wonderful events, and they always make me feel welcome. My life path has been very different from theirs. When I was growing up in Southside Virginia in the 50s and 60s, life was strictly segregated. You know, my parents, I can count on one hand the opportunities I had to interact with African Americans. My parents employed a series of black maids, colored women as they call them, as in my colored woman comes in on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I never heard my parents use the N-word. They were too genteel for that. In the summer, black children would show up on our door, selling fresh blackberries they had picked in the wild. And there was Charlie Williams, the kindly black man who delivered groceries from his store across town and always had a lollipop or a stick of gum in his pocket for me. But for the most part, my perceptions of African Americans were filtered through societal prisons of stereotype and ridicule. I remember my father once took me to a minstrel show at the local high school, where white men in blackface engaged in exaggerated caricatures for laughs. I was too young to grasp the racist attitude behind that, but looking back on it today makes me cringe. In 1954, a year before I started first grade, the Supreme Court ruled in Brown versus Board of Education that racially segregated schools were unconstitutional. But it would be more than a decade before Virginia fully complied. Well into high school, my classes continued to be lily white. U.S. Senator Harry Byrd, who was the longtime boss of the state's political establishment, declared a policy of massive resistance, he called it, to school integration. One of his trusted lieutenants was this guy. Anybody recognize him? His name is Bill Tuck. He was a prime architect of massive resistance. He was the governor of Virginia in the late 40s, later a congressman. He was this Falstaffian, cigar-chomping, bourbon-swilling country lawyer who grew up in Halifax County, right next to Mecklenburg, not far from my grandparents. He would show up on election day often at my grandfather's country store, which was also the local polling place. Um, in 1949, during his governorship, he was a guest at my grandparents' 50th wedding anniversary. He made it very clear where he stood on the Brown decision. In one speech, he said this was in 1955. I intend to resist with all the might I have this effort to distort the minds, to pollute the education, and to defile and make putrid the pure Anglo-Saxon blood that courses through the innocent veins of our helpless children. He said integrated schools would lead to a merger of the races, which would ultimately result in a hybridized human, if human it would be. Ouch. That was, that was considered acceptable political discourse in the South of the 1950s. Most of you probably know how the story turned out. It ended up in 1958, they actually closed the schools in several Virginia localities to keep from integrating them. And in one locality in Southside Virginia, Prince Edward County, the schools were closed for 5 years, effectively denying a generation of African-American children an education. By 1965, Virginia schools had adopted what was euphemistically called a freedom of choice plan. This allowed Black parents to send their kids to white schools if they wanted to go. And the result was just token integration by a handful of brave African-American families. I remember there were 2 Black girls in my graduating class of 100. And looking back on it, I can only imagine that life was just a living hell for them. When they weren't being ostracized, they were being humiliated as the butt of racist jokes and pranks. I recall white boys on my school bus singing "Bye Bye Blackbird" when the bus dropped off a Black student at the end of the day. Even some teachers took part in the persecution. My senior English teacher, who otherwise was a fine teacher, mercilessly embarrassed the one Black girl in my class in front of her peers when she couldn't come up with the answer to a question. I didn't actively participate in the racist behavior, but I'm ashamed to say that I didn't actively resist it either. As I was sort of gliding through my segregated childhood, Daffodil Graham was growing up just 25 miles away in Roxborough, North Carolina, across the state line and the color line. Daffodil is one of Uncle George's great nieces. Here she is paying him a visit. Daffodil is close to my age. Neither of us was aware of the other's existence growing up or of the historical connection between our 2 families. She, like me, grew up in the separate but unequal era. She could see the white high school from her back porch, but she had to walk across town to the all-Black Person County High School. There was no bus provided. Here she is at her prom when she was 16. When she passed the elementary school, she'd have to cross to the other side of the street to get out of the earshot of the racial epithets that were hurled her way from the background, the playground. The story of the Black and white Sizemores is sort of the story of American apartheid in microcosm. In 1900, my great grandmother lived on a farm on the south side of the Dan River, just just downstream from where my slave-owning ancestor lived. Her husband, Thomas, the Civil War soldier who was injured at Gettysburg, had died in 1898. The following year, her oldest son, Richard, my grandfather, married his bride, Georgia Sneed. Here they are. What I knew that from just family history, but what I didn't know until I began doing my research was that my great grandmother's house was surrounded by African American Sizemore households. Right next door to her lived Daniel Sizemore, Uncle George's grandfather, born into slavery in 1834, and a half a dozen other Sizemore freedmen lived just a stone's throw from my ancestors, almost certainly as sharecroppers. But over the next few decades, that American apartheid became so rigid, so complete, that the bonds that had bound the black and white Sizemores together had been erased from both families' collective memory. A century later, when I met Uncle George and his kinfolk, we met as total strangers, all of us unaware of our shared history. Our families who once lived side by side had been torn asunder by this invisible wall. We went to separate schools, we lived in separate neighborhoods, we attended separate churches. That wall has begun to break down over the past half century or so, but I think we've got a long way to go. As a white male born into a middle-class household, I was afforded benefits based purely on my skin color. I've come to realize that I stand on the backs of millions of Africans and their descendants who played an integral role in building this nation with no compensation for their labors, often under the most inhumane conditions. Belated as it was, learning my family's history compelled me to do something positive with the knowledge. So for starters, I decided to scale that invisible wall and reach out to the descendants of those my ancestors enslaved. And I got to say, from the moment I met them, they have been unfailingly warm, kind, generous with their time and good humor. We become good friends. In 2013, with the two dueling reunions going on about 10 miles apart, I invited the Black Sizemores to stop by our reunion for a get acquainted visit. And to my delight, a whole convoy of about a dozen of them, led by Uncle George, showed up. About the same number of my relatives had arrived at the church social hall where we always met, within sight of the cemetery where my grandparents and other forebears are buried. The two families mingled together pleasantly for an hour or so. And I have the pictures to prove it. There we are. As our visitors drove off that afternoon, my cousin Dan leaned over to me and said, "That sound you hear is my father rolling over in his grave." 2 years later, when the Black Sizemore reunion returned to Mecklenburg, I gave their family a progress report on my research and said, "I hope that telling our story would contribute in some small way towards healing the nation's racial wounds." I said, "White Americans have a lot to atone for, and we need to say it plainly. My family stole your family's liberty, their labor, and their human dignity, and I'm sorry." The result of all that research was my book. which, shameless plug, is available on Amazon if anyone is interested. I should probably mention that the profits from the sale of the book go to a college scholarship fund for Uncle George's family. I'm just going to wrap up here because I want to save some time for your questions and comments. I'll just say this. An African-American friend of mine once told me that it's naive to think that telling the Sizemore story can help undo 4 centuries of American racism. And she is no doubt right. I plead guilty to naivete. But I'm still determined to do what I can. As another friend of mine once said, Black and white Americans got into this mess together, and we've got to get out of it together. I think and hope that we can. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and open it up. I would welcome your questions, comments. Don't hold back. I'm happy to take all comers. Who has a question?
Well, let me start. You should all be able to unmute yourself in order to ask Bill questions. So please do so. You may want to keep yourself muted until you have a question. But anyhow, Ms. Roach, I think you had your hand up.
I did. And what I wanted to say was, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. We hear a lot, we read a lot, and the bottom line is, how can we personally make reparations? And I hear what you're doing about your book. It's a small matter, but I've been working on a couple of groups, and one thing we have is a list of 103 things you can do to improve racial relations. And one of them is, I'll give a couple. One is to support Black businesses in your community. And if you do your research here in Williamsburg, I know 5 off the top of my head. The other thing is buy books from a Black bookstore, okay? I had to go to Northern Virginia to find that, and you pay more than you pay on Amazon because you pay shipping. As small as that seems, I feel like I'm doing a little something.
Ms. Roach, would you mind, can I send you a private chat with my email address and
Sure.
send that to me so that I can share that on our resources
Sure.
page? Thank
Sure.
you.
Uh-huh.
Bill, one person asked, what year did you start in Utah? And
That was, as I recall, 2009. It's been about a 10-year effort. The book came out in 2018. Somebody had their hand up.
I have a question. I do.
Yes,
I
Lynette.
apologize if you covered this right at the beginning, but what was it, do you think, that prompted your desire to go search and to do this research? Was there anything in particular, or just kind of a growing thought on your part?
You know, as I said, it just never occurred to me to wonder whether I was descended from slave owners. But finally, you know, as I guess I was in my 60s at the time, it finally did. You know, I sort of started to put 2 and 2 together. You know, I came from this rural part of Southern Virginia, known for its tobacco farms. I knew that I had ancestors there pre-Civil War. So I thought, that's something I ought to look into. And so I did, and that's, as I said, once I learned that I was descended from slave owners, I had to find out more. I had to, I couldn't put it down. I sort of became obsessed with it. Yeah. Is that David Benedict?
Yes.
Did you?
Yeah,
Yeah.
Bill, I read your book and you did a great job, as I think I communicated with you at one point, telling the story of how the Reconstruction period was destroyed by Jim Crow and all the things that were done within the state of Virginia to keep people from participating equally in economically and politically and whatever. And then towards the end of your book, on page 127, I want to read one paragraph. In 2013, the median white household's net worth was 13 times that of Black households. In Black America, poverty rates are 145% higher. Infant mortality is 130% higher. Unemployment is double that of whites. Young Black males are 21 times more likely than whites to be shot dead by police. 1/3 of Black males born today, can expect to go to prison sometime in their lifetime. Blacks and whites use illegal drugs at roughly the same rates, but Blacks are incarcerated at 6 times the rate of whites for drug offenses. If you just take that one paragraph, if you were to break that down in terms of getting a picture of where things stand right now, wouldn't you have a roadmap for what needs to be done to right the wrongs and to make an even playing field?
Yeah, I'd say you're exactly right, David. There are, and here I'll, return to the matter of reparations, which Kathy brought up. Reparations can take many forms. They could be, cash payments to individual people, but there are plenty of other forms that it could take. Money could be spent to try to reduce some of those racial disparities that you just outlined from the book. For instance, we could equalize funding of schools. Black kids today, so many Black kids today are trapped in these poor schools in in inner cities or perhaps in rural areas. They're funded by the local tax, by local taxes, and they don't have the money. They don't have the money. They whereas affluent white jurisdictions spend way more money on schools. That could be one form of reparations, equalizing that school funding. Criminal justice reforms certainly would be another way. It looks like Virginia, for instance, it looks like Virginia is getting ready to legalize recreational marijuana. That, if it happens, that would go a long way towards reducing the disparity, the racial disparities in criminal justice, because as you read, Blacks and whites use drugs about at the same rate, but Blacks are locked up at 6 times the rate of whites. You could just go down the list. Yes, you're exactly right, David.
What would you say to the common citizen who wants to do something about evening the playing field or trying to correct some of the inequities. What would you recommend from what you have learned and your experience in terms of how should they become engaged in this?
Yeah, one thing I would say when people ask me, what can I do? I would say, do what I've done. You don't necessarily need to do it in the way that I did it. I, in the course of researching my book, became good friends. I acquired a whole new circle of African American friends. I had had very few up until that point. A coworker here or there, but for the most part, I had lived in my white bubble. What I saw once I sort of became an honorary member of the Black Sizemore family was these people are just like me. There's no difference. Skin color is a purely surface distinction. And once you get to know someone on a personal one-to-one basis, it can change your whole perspective. So I think maybe that's where it starts. Just, being proactive, trying to, get out of your comfort zone and get to know people across the color line, and it can really enlarge your perspective. Yeah, Andrew.
A couple things actually I wanted to ask you. One from the writing perspective. At what point did you know, as a reporter, that you had a story that you could work with? And second, I understand you're involved with Coming to the Table.
Yes.
If you wouldn't mind telling people about the work that organization's doing.
Yeah, for sure. To your first question, I decided pretty early on that I had a book here. I was lucky in so many ways. Not the least of which is finding Uncle George. He was just a wonderful resource. And once I met him, I realized that I had the makings of a book here. Coming to the Table, I actually mention it towards the end of the book. It's an organization, it's been around about 15 years now, I guess. National organization. It was founded by two people. One, a descendant of the Hairston family, which was one of the largest slave-owning families in the country. They had dozens of plantations with thousands of slaves from Virginia to Mississippi. And then the other co-founder was a descendant of Thomas Jefferson, a white descendant of Thomas Jefferson. And this was not too long after the revelations about the children that Jefferson fathered with Sally Hemings. The two of them got together and founded Coming to the Table. The name is taken from the famous quote from Dr. Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech. I have a dream that one day the sons of slaves and the sons of slave owners will sit down together at the table of brotherhood. And that is what Coming to the Table tries to do. They try to bring together descendants of enslavers and of the enslaved to come together at the table and have these tough discussions about race, and to join together to try to work towards an anti-racist America. There is a local chapter of it, by the way, if any of you are interested. The Historic Triangle chapter of Coming to the Table. It's one of about 40 chapters across the country. We generally meet once a month. We used to have, before COVID, we would get together in person and we would eat. We would literally sit down at the table together and have a meal, share a meal. Since COVID, of course, we've been meeting remotely, but we hope to get back to those dinner gatherings before too long. So yeah, if anyone's interested, you can Google it. They have a website, and you would all be welcome. Who else has a question or a comment?
Good evening.
Hi.
This is Benjamin Sizemore.
Hey, Benji, how are you doing? I didn't know you were there with us.
I'm well. Yes, I'm well.
For those of you who don't know him, Benji is one of the African American Sizemores. I assume he's got to be named for his ancestor, Ben, right?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Benji.
That's for my name. Yeah, I was just here to chime in. And I'm still currently living in Mecklenburg County and still living in Clarksville, as a matter of fact, in the community. And one of the things I just wanted to mention is in regards to the book is the fact that not only does it give some aspects in regards to the family histories between us, but it also focuses on a lot of the history within the town of Clarksville and in Mecklenburg County. That I think is very important. I think a lot of the history that was in the town and in that vicinity is not really talked about and discussed. I know in one part you discuss about that was an African American who was a part of the House of Delegates from Boydton.
Right.
And being brought up in Mecklenburg County and gone through Mecklenburg County public schools, that was never, ever, ever mentioned. That an African American from the town was in the House of Delegates during that period of Reconstruction. That was never focused. So I think that things like that are very important. One thing we talk about when you mention as far as dividing or as far as actually coming to some type of resolution when we talk about racism and we talk about disparities within the Black community and whatnot. Also to look into reading books from authors that discuss that in detail in regards to the causes of this economic divide. There are many different authors, many different people, scholars, economists rather, that focus on the situations why there's such a big racial or a big economic divide between African Americans and whites. And reading those books and understanding that in full is also helpful. There are many people that have done that. I just read one myself from a gentleman by the name of Dr. Claude Anderson. I don't know if you've heard of him.
What's the name of the book?
His is called White Labor, Black Wealth.
I haven't read
Wealth, Black Labor, Black Wealth, White Labor.
I'll have to look that one up. I haven't read that one.
Yeah, very good. He's been in the political scene for well over 40, 50 years. Has done a lot of work in regards to economics and how African Americans, or it is basically focused on what African Americans need to do in regards to help generating wealth, help in establishing themselves, making sure that in their communities that they have the resources that have not been there since the 1600s. So literature like that, I think, is helpful. I think that if people get an opportunity to read these type of books, it gets a better understanding that it's more than just people in sheets walking around killing people, that it becomes a lot deeper than that. And I think that once people get an understanding of it and know this, you can start having the mindset change, the narrative change, so to speak.
Right. Good point. Thank you, Benji. Incidentally, speaking of books, if reading this book, Stamped, has piqued your interest, I recommend that you read Ibram Kendi's two books. The one that Stamped is based on, Stamped from the Beginning, which is a history, very exhaustive history of racist ideas. And then he followed that up with a book called How to Be an Anti-Racist, which is very helpful for us white folks. He gives some good advice about how to be an anti-racist. And Benji's right. There's many other books that are out there that are helpful too. Yeah, Andrew.
Oh, I was going to say that. Now I forget what I was going to say. Actually, Sarah Lewis just sent a message in chat saying that she was kind of surprised that you didn't find more genetic cousins, that when she went through Ancestry Family Finder, that she found 25 Black cousins who are probably descended from her slave-owning ancestors in Matthews. And oh yes, and the other thing was that Ibram Kendi also had a number of very profound moments in his own experience of discovering the traces of racist thoughts that had been incorporated in his learning. And yes, it's a wonderful book for examining your own conscience, not when it just when it comes to racism, but also when it comes to our perception of anybody who is different from us, and our perception of things that we have learned as just, in the phrasing of our common everyday language. So I would, again, heartily encourage you to read that. For anyone who's in a book group, it is available. If you're not familiar with the Gab bags, it is available as a book group kit that you can check out. And
which book is that, Andrew?
How to Be an Anti-Racist.
Oh, good.
And Stamped is also going to be one.
Mm-hmm. To the point about how did it come to be that I don't have any genetic cousins, that Benji and I are not related by blood. Some of us were surprised by that. So, some of the Black Sizemores, as well as myself, we were a little surprised because, as I said, that was very, very common. It's something that white folks, I think, have only really come to realize relatively recently, but I think most Black folks have known it all along,
Based on your record and what you had done in your research, it looked as if a lot of, with my descendants were male. Daniel Sizemore, who would have been my great grandfather, and then Ben Sizemore, my great grandfather, were on record as far as ownership. And that perhaps could have been a lot to would have done with, could have been the reason mainly that they were male enslaved,
right?
Ancestors.
Good point. Anybody else want to chime in? Yeah, there's someone down there. Who's that? Oh, hi.
Hi, Beth. My thing doesn't come up on the screen for some reason. But anyway, I'm Beth Haw, and I know Bill because Bill's spoken with All Together. All Together is a group here in town that meet regularly, and we've had Bill as a guest. But I wanted to say that this community itself has disparities that as community members we can look into. Those disparities exist in our education and our housing and our medical opportunities. So if you really want to dig into this, there are some disparities here right in our own town. But I wanted to thank you, Bill, for sharing. Your book is amazing, and you have so much. You say it well, and your writing is really quite good and easy to get. Also, we have a bystander training that's coming up. All Together is offering. So if anyone's interested in knowing a little bit about All Together, All Together is here in Williamsburg. We've been here for over 25 years talking about race.
Yeah.
We have a website, alltogetherwilliamsburg.org.
I highly recommend that group, by the way, all together. They've been doing this work for a long time, way more than I have. Beth, what exactly is bystander training?
So the notion of, instead of standing by if you encounter a situation that you're not exactly sure how to handle it, some people will walk away. So what our training will do is to help give you some tools, give you some scenarios that you might encounter. I did hear it's filling up quite fast, and we may actually have to do a second one because that's not a bad problem to have.
That's a great problem.
Yeah. So I'm very, I think it's wonderful that if we could get people to come and learn how to be, active allies. It's really important. Barb Watson is in the room with me. I'm the president of All Together.
Hey, Barb.
And Barb is the vice president of All Together, and we welcome you to come and join in. We have Zooms, and of course that's what we're doing right now. But come and see what we're about.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'm going to send you my email address as well, and if you could send me the information about the not bystander training again, I'd appreciate. Actually, what the heck? Why don't I just give it to everybody? It's simple: asmith@wrl.org. So if you have any resources, or if you know of people, or if you're doing work with any organizations, please let me know, because we are, as I said, this is not a 1 month and we're done kind of thing. We really would like to be able to assemble resources.
There's a lot of work to do.
That's for sure.
So much.
Yeah. Thank you for putting this on, by the way, as well.
Were there any other questions?
I have a question.
Hey, Barb.
Hey, how are you doing?
Good.
How you've talked to your family, you asked the question, you've developed relationships now with the other Sizemores. How have you had negative reactions from family members or other white folks who are upset or concerned about the fact that you're even asking the questions or trying to find out about your heritage?
Yeah, good question. I have not received any overtly negative reactions from my family. I received some positive comments. But I would say in most cases, people just haven't said anything, which may be a reflection of that, that old Southern phenomenon of, if you can't say anything nice, don't say anything. There may be some of that going on. I don't know. But I will say this. I have been part of a group at the national level of Coming to the Table, a group of writers, several of whom have undertaken projects similar to mine. They have they have discovered that they are descended from slave owners, and they have talked about it and written, and in several cases written about it. And some of them received very, very negative reactions from family members. In one or two cases, they're no longer on speaking terms. So, you know, I guess I consider myself lucky that I haven't gotten more negative reaction. It's that old phenomenon of denial. People just don't want to go there. They don't want to. They don't want to know. They don't want to know. They'd rather turn away from it.
Well, the phrase that you use in the book, and I think you mentioned it earlier, self-induced amnesia.
Yeah.
And it really is. I'm going to extend that to self-induced blindness, and
Right.
It may very well be that it's easy to close your eyes. It's a lot harder to open your heart.
Yeah. Well said.
Are there any more questions? Anyone like to contribute? Well, I will say, if you go to the library's events webpage, it's wrl.org/events, or take a look down in the chat box. I've got the registration links for tomorrow's dialogue on race with Barbara Ham-Lee. She and I are going to be talking, and we really would like to have questions, answers, comments from everyone who attends. And then Mary Ann Moxon brought up the Lemon Project at William and Mary, which is an organization that's working on remembering and discovering and remembering the contribution of enslaved people to the college. Their next program is in mid-February, I think, maybe towards the end of, sorry, I looked at it just a minute ago. Anyway, it's titled The True Conditions of the Descendants of Africans in America. So that link is there too. Both of those do require registration, and we would, both organizations would love to see you there to participate.
I think it's March 7th.
Is it March 7th? Sorry.
March 27th.
March 27th. Okay. Okay. I'm not right now looking past anything past February 28th.
That's the symposium. The Lemon Project Symposium is what's in late March.
Okay.
This might be something else.
Give me a second to go take a look here. Let's see.
Lemon Project, that's another fine undertaking here in Williamsburg.
Yes.
They have, I found it's the true status of descendants of enslaved Africans in America, a Lemon's Legacy Sports Talk, and that's Monday, February the 15th at 6.
Right. I will say from personal experience, you have to do advanced registration for the Lemon Project. If you miss out, you can also register up to and including the time of the dialogue on race tomorrow.
Workshop on the 16th of
And there are, again, other programs, some of which require registration, the ones that are hosted by William and Mary. So again, please do look into that, and we would very much like to see your participation.
What time is that event tomorrow, Andrew? Do you know? With Barbara
It's at
Hamley?
7 o'clock.
It's what?
7 o'clock.
7 o'clock. Okay.
Yes. So, well, thank you all so very much for coming. Thank you, Bill. I wish we had a better way of showing our gratitude, but we do appreciate your insight and your work on this.
Thanks everybody for being here. I enjoyed it.